In today's session, we are going to discuss about IoT logical design. The IoT devices are used to exchange the data between the connected devices or applications either directly or indirectly. It also collects the data and process the data locally or sends the data to the centralized server to process the data. In IoT logical design, we are going to discuss about different functional blocks, communication models and communication API. The IoT logical design refers to an abstract representation of entities and processes. It consists of functional blocks, communication models, and communication API. In order to build an IoT system logically, we need functional blocks, communication models, and communication APIs. Functional blocks. The IoT system consists of number of functional blocks like devices, services, communication, security, and application. These functional blocks provides the capability for sensing, actuation, identification, communication between the device and the management of device. The device will provide monitoring control functions. It handles the communication between the host and the server. It manages the transfer of data. The functional blocks can also be used to secure the system using authentication and other function. It has an interface to control and monitor various terms. This is the block diagram for IoT functional block. We have application, management, services, communication, security, and device. Application. The application block is an interface which provides the control system that has to be used by the user to view the status of the system and to analyze the system. Management. This block will provide various functions that are used to manage an IoT system. Services. This block will provide some services like monitoring the device, controlling the device, publishing the data, deleting the data, and sometimes restoring the system. Communication. This block will handle the communication between the client and the cloud-based server. It is also responsible for sending and receiving the data using various protocols. Security. This block is used to secure an IoT system using some functions like authorization, data security, authentication, two-step verification, and so on. It makes sure whether the data transferred between the devices is secured. Device. These devices are used to provide sensing, and it is also used to monitor the control functions that collects the data from outer environment using sensors. IoT communication models. There are different types of communication models which are used in IoT system. The models are request response model, publish subscribe model, push pull model, exclusive pair model. These communication models are used to communicate between the system and the server. Request response communication model. Here we have client and the server. The client will send the request to the server and the server will respond back to the client. So whenever the client send the request to the server will fetch the data or it will retrieve the resources that has been requested by the client, and then it sends back the data to the client as per the client's request. In this model, HTTP protocol is used between the client and the server. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. The example for this model is whenever we search a query in a browser, the browser will submit an HTTP request to the server and the server will return a response back to the client. This is the block diagram for request response communication model. Here we have client, server, and resources. The client will send the request to the server. The server will process the request from the client. It will fetch the resources, prepares the resources, and then it sends the resources or a response back to the client. The next model is publish subscribe communication model. In this model, we have a broker between the publisher and the consumer. So we have publisher, consumer and broker here. The publishers are the sources of data because they have the whole data and they are not aware of the consumer. The data which has been sent by the publishers or managed by the brokers. Whenever a consumer is subscribed to a particular topic, the broker will receive the data from the publisher and the broker is responsible for sending the data to all the subscribed consumer. A simple example here is in a website we have been subscribed to some newsletters using our email address. So these email address will be managed by some third party services. Whenever a new article is published on that website, it directly sends to the broker and it is not aware of the consumer. So this broker will take a responsibility and send the data which has been received by the publisher to all the subscribed consumers. This is the block diagram for publish, subscribe, consumer, publish, subscribe communication model. Here we have publisher, broker and consumers. The publisher will send the messages to the broker. So the message will be published to some topics in a broker. The broker will have some consumers that is the consumer will be having some subscribed topics. So consumer will be subscribed to some topics which has been managed by the broker, but the publisher here will not be aware of the consumer. So whenever the data is sent from the publisher to the broker will manage all the datas. When a new data has been published by the publisher will send the data to the broker. The publisher will not send the data directly to the consumer. This broker will take a responsibility and this broker will send the data back to the subscribed consumers based on the subscribed topics. The next model is push-pull communication model. Here the data will be pushed by the producer in a queue and the consumer will pull the data from the queue. Here also we have producer and consumer, but the producers are not aware of the consumer. A simple example here is whenever we visit a website, we will see number of posts in a website that has been published in a queue. So according to our requirements or according to our needs, we'll click on each post and then we'll start reading it. This is the block diagram for push-pull communication model. Here we have a publisher. The publisher will send the message in a queue. So all the message which has been published by the publisher will be in a queue. The consumer will pull back the messages from the queue. The next model is exclusive pair communication model. It is a bi-directional fully duplex communication model. Here there will be a persistent connection between the client and the server. So the client will request for the connection to the server and the server will respond back to the client and the connection will be established. So this connection will remain open until the client requests a close connection to the server. This is the block diagram for exclusive pair communication model. Here we have client and server. The client will request for the setup connection and once the request is received by the server, it will respond back to the client. Then the connection will be established between the client and the server. After the connection is established, the messages will be transferred between the client and the server. Once all the messages are done, the connection has to be closed. So for that, the client will request for the connection close to the server. So the client will send the connection close request to the server and the server will respond for the connection close request to the client. The next one is IoT communication APIs. The API stands for Application Programming Interface. So in IoT we use REST based communication API and WebSocket based communication API. So this API is responsible for communication between the server and the system in an IoT. REST based communication API. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. This API uses some architectural principles or guidelines which are used to design the web services. The main focus of on this API, the main focus of this API is on system resources, because it states how the resource are to be transferred using the request response communication model. So it uses the HTTP and REST principles. So under REST-based communication API, we have client server, stateless and catchable. Here in the client server, the client are not aware of the storage of data, because the concern of the storage is for server only. The server is responsible for the storage of data and the client is responsible for the user interface. This separation is actually needed between the client and the server, because it needs the separation, because for the independent development and updation of the server and the client. Stateless. It means when each request from the client is sent to the server, it contains all the necessary information that has to be understood by the server. If the server does not understand the particular request of the client, then the server can't fetch the request of the data in a proper manner. Catchable. In this response, if the catch constraints are given, then the client can reuse that same response in a later request. This will improve the efficiency and scalability of a system without loading the extra data. The next API is WebSocket based communication API. This API allows bidirectional full duplex communication between the server and the client. It uses exclusive pair communication model. In this, it uses a full duplex communication, so it does not require any new connection setup each and every time when it requests the new data. This WebSocket API begins with a connection setup between the server and the client, as we have seen in the exclusive pair communication model. To begin a connection, that is to establish a connection, the client has to send the connection request to the server, and the server will respond back to the client. Then after establishing a connection, the client and server will be transferring the data between them. So if the WebSocket is supported by the server, it responds back to the client with a successful response. After the setup of connection and the client, so connection of server and the client, it can send the data to each other in a full duplex mode. So this type of API will reduce the traffic and latency of the data. It also makes sure that each time when we request a new data, it cannot terminate the request. Thank you.